So welcome everyone. I know a couple of you are still coming in, this will take a couple of minutes, but we're going to go ahead and get started. It is 5 after 5 on this Friday evening. Thank you for joining us here for Humanities at Home. I am Michael Haley Goldman. I'm the Executive Director of New Hampshire Humanities, and tonight we have a really special program. This is a rebroadcast with live Q&A, which is something we've not tried before, so thank you for being a part of an experiment with all of us. This is an amazing program that we did in partnership with the Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Service back in February. So the program is going to be based on that, but just to make it a lot more fun and interesting, we are really pleased to welcome the original speaker and moderator from that program who will live answer your questions as the program progresses. This also was thanks to Concord TV, which recorded this event and gave us the recording that you're going to be seeing in just a minute. I do need to do all of these quick housekeeping things. First of all, and foremost, this program was made possible through donations and support from viewers like you. In fact, some of you that I see on the call tonight are supporters of this. So thank you for making this and many other programs across the state possible. Last year alone, New Hampshire Humanities supported more than 700 programs with more than 15,000 people in 145 communities. To support our work, to find out more about programs that might be near you, we encourage you to go to newhampshirehumanities.org. You can find information about future talks. You can see other programs. You can sign up for our e-news so you can find out about these programs if you're not already signed up, and basically be part of this community. And we encourage you to do that and be part of the programs that are happening all around the state. We are going to have our panelists tonight answering questions as we go through the program. So we're going to stop every 15 to 20 minutes or so. So keep your questions coming into the chat, and be a mindful participant. Ensure that you are using the chat following general guidelines of civil discourse. We expect that of you as part of our community, and we expect to live up to that ourselves. Finally, I want to say thank you to all the people who made this possible, including the Rudman Center and the representatives from the Rudman Center on the program tonight. But now I can introduce these panelists so we can get going. I'm going to give you a really brief version of these panelists' incredible resumes, and in the chat you will see a full description of the work that they're doing. But I am really pleased to welcome tonight the Honorable William Delker. William Delker is Associate Justice for the New Hampshire Superior Court. I almost gave you a promotion. My apologies. Also want to welcome, I've got to get to the right page though when I'm doing this. Here we go. Professor Lorianne Updike Schulzke, who is a specialist in constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, and legal history. And then finally, Professor Robert Willams, who is currently a Distinguished Professor of Law Emeritus at Rutgers Law School. And they all do an incredible amount of other things, but as you can see, these are long. So to get right to the program, take a look at those in the chat. So without further ado, let's start looking at this program, and I will give you moments to ask questions as we go. So Katie, take it away.
People commonly talk about exercising their First Amendment rights, whether it's free speech or freedom of religion. They talk about taking the Fifth, and people commonly understand that to mean, exercising the right to silence under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But not as many people understand that each state, including New Hampshire, has its own constitution, which contain not only similar rights, but often different or more protective rights than we have under the federal Constitution. And so if you could help us understand the importance that state constitutions play in our system of government, and give us 2 or 3 examples of how New Hampshire's Constitution differs from its federal counterpart.
Thank you. What you're really describing is the great paradox of American constitutionalism. Most everybody understands that we have a national constitution, we have a Supreme Court of the United States, but yet that's really not accessible to any of us. You've had a little access. I've had one tiny. I sent a case to the United States Supreme Court when I was in practice. They turned it down in about 15 minutes. Yet, this understanding comes with no access to the national constitutional structure, or for most people, to the United States Supreme Court. Conversely, most people don't know much about their state constitution, but yet ordinary citizens do have access to state constitutional law processes. You vote on amendments. You elect legislators who can propose amendments. If you have a constitutional convention, you vote for delegates. You get to ratify the product of a constitutional convention or amendments proposed by the legislature. But yet, surveys have shown about 50% of Americans don't even know they have a state constitution. And what's the difference, really? Most people think, the 50% of people who know there's a state constitution think it's a little clone of the U.S. Constitution. But that's wrong. The state constitutions have a different political and legal function in our system. Everybody learns maybe in high school, that the U.S. Constitution enumerates powers. It gives the federal government the familiar powers of providing for national defense, regulating interstate commerce, what have you. The state constitutions are different. You'll remember from high school, all the other functions of government that weren't delegated to the federal government are retained by the states. So you don't have to look in your state constitution to see if your legislature can enact a landlord-tenant code or a criminal law. What you look to primarily in state constitutions, is there any limitation on what your state legislature or governor can do? And so a number of other important things. This audience knows that state constitutions predated the U.S. Constitution. They served as the models for the drafters of the U.S. Constitution, and a number of other things. They're amendable in a way that U.S. Constitution is not. Here's a couple of examples, and I'll stop. Look at your Constitution. You have a state equal rights amendment. It has failed so far at the federal level, and very recently, 2018, I think you have a textual privacy clause in your Constitution, which the U.S. Constitution doesn't have, and you have this fascinating Article 83 that requires the state to encourage literature and science and deal with corporations and all sorts of things that are not in the federal Constitution. So they're really different.
So, Professor Updike Schulzke, I want to take you back to the beginning. As Justice Bassett mentioned a moment ago, on January 5th, we celebrated the 250th anniversary of New Hampshire's first Constitution. And you wrote a fascinating story about the saga from the development of that Constitution through the current Constitution that we have with amendments that was adopted and ultimately went into effect in 1784. So we could probably spend hours on that topic alone, but if you could give us three or four highlights that you discovered in your research and writing of that journey.
Sure. First, I just want to say it's a rare privilege to be here. If states were spirit animals, New Hampshire would be mine. I lived here. Well, I lived here for 3 years before I started at Yale after living in London, and if I could, I'd still live here. I really love New Hampshire. So there's a reason why I focus on the New Hampshire Constitution. And as an academic, you write these things, and you just do it because you love it, and you don't ever expect that anybody will read it. So this is just delightful to be here. So the question goes back to what are the things that I discovered that were unique and interesting? So the story was fascinating. There's twists and turns, and I want to tell you just about a few. So first of all, most of you have heard of the name of John Sullivan, right? Okay. So he plays a role in the New Hampshire Constitution at several points. Most of you know him as General Sullivan, but before he was general, he was a delegate to the Continental Congress, and he got to be friendly with John Adams. Now, John Adams came from the state where, of course, we first heard the shot heard around the world, right? April 19th, 1775, Lexington and Concord. But Massachusetts was a hotbed of the Revolution long before that, and they had deposed their governor their royal governor as early as 1774. So they get a general for a governor, British general. He's deposed, and government stops working. It's COVID all over. Well, it's pre-COVID, not all over again, but this is the original COVID, where the wheels of government just stop because the royal governor is supposed to call the judges. He's supposed to prorogue or call the legislature and dismiss it, and they have elections, but he doesn't call the legislature. So in their place, they have basically a renegade, a rump legislature meets. And they're operating without any authority. So when John Adams goes to Congress, Massachusettsans have been talking about taking up government. They didn't have the word constitution as we use it now. They made a new meaning for an old word, describing a constellation of institutions as a government, as a constitution to a fixed written document. So when he gets to Congress, he says in his autobiography, he preaches new, strange, and terrible doctrines in Congress that nobody really wants to listen to. But John Sullivan does, okay? So so Congress meets the second time, May 15th, 1775, almost 1 month after, not quite a month after Lexington and Concord. May 31st, the Massachusetts rump legislature writes to Congress to say, so basically almost immediately say, can we write a constitution? Congress comes back and says, no, you have a charter, use your charter. So Adams and John Sullivan get together and say, oh, well, New Hampshire, as you probably all know, doesn't have a charter. So you get people in New Hampshire to petition Congress for a constitution, and we'll get them to approve it. Well, Sullivan writes to those who are in power in the province, as they call it now, and the person he writes to, who's the president of the convention, as they call it, their legislature, before it was before the 1776 Constitution, says, look, my wife is so sick, I haven't been able to change my shirt in 2 weeks, so sorry, too busy, but that sounds like a good idea. So John Sullivan makes it up. I confirmed this in like 5 different ways. He makes up a petition, the petition from New Hampshire that's recorded in the Journal of the Continental Congress, completely made up by John Sullivan and his co-delegates. And we know this because the day, November 16th, 1775, when Congress approves New Hampshire to write a constitution, is the same day that in the fourth convention, is what they called their legislature at the time, in the fourth convention that they approved the committee to come up with the petition. So that they go back to elect their delegates for the fifth convention that meets in December of 1775, and they don't know that Congress has approved them. So they come back. Okay, so that's the first really interesting thing, is that there's a bit of a white lie in this history. Second is that you have a civil war going on up in the Upper River Valley due to somebody's ancestors, right? During the Revolutionary War. So those from Connecticut travel up to the Upper River Valley and they settle on both sides. They're connected by blood and geography with a river in the middle. The problem is, early in the 1700s, that the river was designed as the border of New Hampshire, and beyond that, it was controversial territory claimed by New York and Massachusetts. But the Green Mountain Boys, as they were called, on the other side of the Green Mountains, so as you probably, I'm sure you all know, the Upper River Valley is between White Mountains and Green Mountains, kind of generally, these people want to be connected, and yet people are pulling them from different sides. And what happens is that those who start Dartmouth, these two little buildings that the history books say that rise and sag with the frost every year. And it's Ivy League institution now. They're backwoods academics, but they know their stuff. So when the electoral precept, as they called it, comes up for this 5th provincial, they call it a convention, there's only one person that's supposed to represent all of the Upper River Valley, and they are ticked. They don't like this. And so when they come, they don't send anybody as a way to object. And they send the founder of Dartmouth's son, and he basically in Exeter, they're like, go back to your cows. No, we're not going to approve you having any more delegates here. Anyway, so this controversy starts a civil war, and the Upper River Valley goes back and forth to Vermont. And finally, and Vermont's not even a state, right? They have a constitution in 1777, but they're not approved as a state until 1791. They're petitioning to be a state this whole time. And because the Upper River Valley doesn't get what they want, they then threaten to secede. And finally, when Washington finds out, this doesn't end until Washington finds out about this, that Vermont has actually talked to Canada. Yeah. So he sends a little veiled threat and said, hey, cut it out or I'm coming up there. I've already won Yorktown. I bet I can beat Vermont. So they stop, 1781. And but this controversy, the Constitution goes through several iterations. You've got 1776, which is a very 900-word document. It's very it's the first Constitution. It's very, very important. It's the first modern Constitution in the world. It's incredibly important, but it's short, it's terse, and it's very simple. But what you get then in 1778 is a little bit better, not much, but in 1781, 82, 83, it's basically all the same document. The only thing that changes finally that gets it over the line is that Upper River Valley finally comes into play. And this is known, and some of the research that I did that hadn't been done before, is that we have the head of the opposition, everybody's related to everybody, right? Everybody's related to everybody, is that the Dartmouth founder's son-in-law, Basilio Woodard, complicated name, Basilio Woodard. He's a really powerful academic with great ideas, and he's read everything clearly. So but he comes over, and he's actually included by George Atkinson, who's the head of the Constitutional Convention in New Hampshire, as part of the drafters and the drafting committee. And he gets Meshach Ware, that Ware's named after, who's the head of he's the governor. We'll get into him a little bit later. But they bring him and the head of the opposition together. And there's a polemical or basically letters to the editor in the newspapers, and they go back and forth. And they get really mad at each other, and Meshach Ware basically says, oh, but we shouldn't change the Constitution because the person who's president has done such a good job. And then Woodard kind of takes off the mask and says, oh, well, you are Meshach Ware, and so you're just self-aggrandizing yourself. Anyway, so these are the types of things, but people notice, oh my goodness, they've finally come together, they're working together, even though they clearly hate each other. They're working together on the Constitution, and that's what gets it past the finish line.
So I'm going to go back to you, Professor Willams. You alluded to this in your comments. This history is fascinating, but how does it impact the drafting of the federal Constitution? So virtually every state, not a couple of exceptions in there, had drafted their own constitutions in this period, including New Hampshire, as we just heard, prior to 1787, when the Federal Constitutional Convention meets in Philadelphia. So what influence do these early state constitutions have on the document we get out of the federal government?
There's a tremendous influence this way. A large proportion of the delegates who wrote the federal Constitution had spent the prior decade working on drafting, arguing, compromising the state constitutions. I've counted around 20, I think I should say now something like 22 state constitutions during this 11-year period, 1776 to 1787. But it wasn't just the written constitutions. It was the arguments that took place over developing them, the arguments that took place over amending them. A number of the states there were 4 shots at it here just by 1784. But even in addition, a large proportion of these delegates in Philadelphia had experience serving in office in the states during that 11-year period. So they knew not only how to write and draft and argue about these kinds of documents, but they knew how they actually started to work on the ground, so to speak. And as you heard, this was real politics. It wasn't academic pie in the sky kind of hopeful stuff. It was really, how are we going to run a government now? And so by the time we had the federal constitution, we had a lot of experience in framing constitutions and making them work or not work.
So the Professor Updike Schulzke, you alluded to this in your opening remarks. The process for adopting the original 1776 Constitution was quite a bit different from the end product that we ended up with in 1784. Can you explain the differences between, so how was the 1776 Constitution crafted and adopted and ultimately the end product in 1784? What were the differences there?
So somebody who studies constitutional process, and I do this not just locally but around the world, New Hampshire is fascinating because not only do you have the first constitution, modern constitution in the world, you then have the first constitutional convention, first ratification, and the first public participation, direct public participation, and you don't see that again until the 1990s in South Africa. You also have the very first, again, you haven't seen this till very recently, one-issue referendum on the executive, because Meshach Ware is so upset. But the differences are these. So in the 1776 Constitution, it's an elected legislature that's writing it, okay? They don't even know that they're going to be tasked with writing a constitution. They know it's possible. But the approval from Congress, remember, there's no email, there's no Twitter. It comes after the electoral precept is sent out. So the electoral precept or the law saying you can write a constitution, the electoral precept is directing them of how to elect people, says in the event that they're going to write a constitution, then the people that you elect will be drafting one. But it's not per se a special election. Okay, so that's one. You have a legislature drafting this. And what happens, I just had a student ask me yesterday, how do you interpret a document where the legislature enacts the Constitution and then later they pass a bill that abrogates the Constitution, right? What do you do with that? It's a great question. How do you interpret the Constitution then? Because there's a Concord, Massachusetts shoemaker who comes up with a theory of why this is a problem, of why you shouldn't have legislatures drafting constitutions, because this is the same body that enacts the rights can't protect them. They can unmake the Constitution. The power to create is the power to destroy. Okay, so, but before Massachusetts does it, Massachusetts is actually attributed in most histories with the idea, not only the idea, but the implementation of the first Constitutional Convention. That is not true. New Hampshire is. These Dartmouth founders came up with what they call the College Hall Address, and they say, the legislature can't do this. We need a special body. Now, they weren't as sophisticated as the shoemaker in Concord in saying the power to destroy is the power to create, but they said, look, we have our popular sovereignty. We have the power. We haven't given it to them to write a constitution. We've only given them legislating power. So that was a big difference. That the next, basically 1778, 81, 82, 83, it's all a constitutional convention. That's the 1778 first in the nation. Also ratification, a really, really big deal to send it out to the towns. And then, because it kept not getting passed, they got more and more creative. Okay, send in your people. Okay, even if you fail the Constitution, send in representatives from the town and tell us why you're rejecting this. There's a lot of discussion, and eventually they get tired of it, and it's not until they come together that they finally get this passed. But all of these innovations happen for the second Constitution in 1784.
Oh, Michael, we can't hear you.
Fascinating.
Got it.
Did it come back in?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Really funny because I'm not on mute, so who knows what's going on. Thank you for your patience as we continue to work this out. We're going to pause here for a couple quick questions. I have a really interesting one from Liz, which is looking kind of in amazement with all the creativity going on in different states as they're creating different constitutions, and yet they came together eventually to create a single one. Wouldn't people want to see what they were doing in their own states be moved forward rather than what was happening somewhere else? Was there an issue of who got, to have control over what the Constitution eventually looked like for the U.S.?
Bob, do you want to maybe tackle that, sort of how that process worked a little?
I could take a little crack at it. This was a period of trial and error. It was explicitly considered to be a period of experimentation. And there was a tremendous amount of give and take among at least the 11 new states that were working on constitutions. Two of the states just relied on their charters. And ideas, pamphlets, broadsides pasted up on buildings about these questions. Who should be able to vote? Who should be able to serve in office? What sort of structures should protect the people? Should there be independent courts? All of this stuff, separately elected governors, all of these things were debated up and down the seaboard, and there was a developing consensus around two major points, and that was one, there should be a separately elected, as we just heard, a separately elected body with one task: draft and propose a constitution. They didn't run for re-election. They didn't pass ordinary laws. And secondly, they had to send out their proposed constitution to the voters in those days. Some in parts of New England it was town meetings. And the voters had the final say on whether this would be the governing document. And there were a lot, as I said, the experiments were going on for the first 7 or 8 years of this so-called founding decade. And there ultimately was a kind of consensus that developed in 1780 in the Massachusetts Constitution. And then by 1784 in New Hampshire, we sort of had quickly figured out we wanted to have a government that had two branches of the legislature, a lower house and an upper house, an independently elected governor, and an independent set of courts, together with a Bill of Rights. And lo and behold, that's what our United States Constitution looks like.
Loriana, did you have other thoughts on that
Yeah,
subject as well?
yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So during the time of the founding, between 1776 and 1787 and beyond even, you have people from various states talking about their state as if it's their country. So Jefferson famously calls Virginia his country. He is not unique. Many people, just as you're saying, Liz, thought that their model was the correct one. But as Professor Willams has said, there was a growing consensus not only as to substance, but as to procedure. There's some radicals in Philadelphia that are led by some of Thomas Paine's friends who enact their constitution in 1776. It has a unicameral legislature, it has yearly elections, and people are just in and out of office. There's not really an executive, nor, if I remember correctly, and Bob, correct me if I'm wrong, or Professor Williams, correct me if I'm wrong, there's not necessarily an independent judiciary. That's
Absolutely.
because, is that correct, Professor Williams?
Exactly.
Okay. So they're reacting to having a king, and then eventually they see, oh, this doesn't work. This doesn't work well. We need a different model, and maybe we need something in between this highly democratic, high turnover model and something like the British system. And as they write constitutions, they're not all written at the same time. You have an influx before the Declaration of Independence, and in 1776, peters out a little bit in 1777. And then you finally get, you have a couple of them rewritten in South Carolina. They rewrite theirs in 78. And then you finally get Massachusetts in 80. And then this whole time, New Hampshire's trying to get theirs, their second one, their permanent constitution. So by 80 and then 84, 80 is Massachusetts, 84 is New Hampshire, which is largely based on the Massachusetts model. You have something that people are saying, oh, this looks like it works. You have an executive with some staying power. They have a veto power that you can override. You have an independent judiciary. So where people are seeing these ideas evolve over time, they're still, when they get to the Constitutional Convention, which I've studied a lot, you're still having people try to advocate for what's happening in their country. But there is this growing consensus over what works, and that's one reason why they're able to come up with a federal document.
All right, thank you both. Let's go ahead and kick back in and go a little farther. I see there's a question from Nancy, but we'll pick that up on the next round. So, Katie, take it away.
So let me just remind the audience, we'd love to get your questions. So if you do have questions for our panelists, just write them out on the piece of paper and hold it up, and somebody will come around and collect it. But while we're waiting for questions from the audience, I want to follow up on that point with you, Professor Willams. In your, you talked about this a bit just a moment ago, but and in your book on the law of American constitutions, you note that some states have completely reworked their constitutions. I think you noted that Louisiana has been through some 11 different constitutions. Georgia has had 10 different constitutions. Now, New Hampshire, as we've been talking about tonight, has really only had two constitutions. The first from 1776 and this 1784 version. New Hampshire's constitution, though, has been amended, about 150 amendments or so over the last 200 years. And as you said, in 2018, voters approved the right to privacy, and the same year they approved taxpayer standing. And more recently, voters rejected raising the age of judges. My wife and I canceled each other out on this one because she wants me to retire and I don't want to retire. But constitutions like New Hampshire's, which have existed for 200 years, have been amended. And so I'm wondering if you could talk to us about the difference between those incremental amendments and full-scale revisions of a constitution and why those are different.
Sure. It's a very big difference. And may I say, I think my prediction is Massachusetts and New Hampshire will never revise their constitutions, because Massachusetts likes to say it has the oldest written constitution in the world, and New Hampshire likes to say we have the second oldest. So it's never going to happen. But there's a big difference. Primarily, we call it piecemeal amendment, little by little change, usually emanates from the legislature. Now you have we'll talk about it a little bit later, you have the automatic 10-year vote on whether they have a constitutional convention. But the process of amendment in most states is based on legislative gatekeeping. You don't get to vote unless the legislature proposes an amendment. It works pretty well, but often you can have an amendment that turns out to sort of conflict with another provision in the Constitution if the legislative proposal is not careful. A constitutional convention, though, a complete rewriting. Now, they never rewrite the whole Constitution. Many clauses are carried over unchanged. But this involves a constitutional convention invented in New England for the sole purpose of drafting a constitution or revising an existing constitution. These delegates are elected, and they're not running for re-election like legislators. It makes a huge difference in how they operate. And then, of course, they have to develop this also in New England. They have to put their proposal out for a vote of the people again. But the processes lead to a different kind of deliberation. Piecemeal amendments, very important to have to make specific kinds of changes like we've described here, but rethinking a whole constitutional structure requires a different kind of compromise, a different kind of deliberation, and so it's important to have both available in the states.
So to follow up on that, I think Thomas Jefferson was one of the proponents of this idea that a constitution should be revised every, I think he said 20 years or so, but basically every generation in order to keep it fresh and to make it reflect the values of the current generation.
It's the land belongs in usufruct to the living. It should be renewed every 20 years by the new blood.
Yes, and that's exactly the sentiment I was looking for. And so I'm wondering about both of your thoughts on the value of stability in documents like the New Hampshire, Massachusetts Constitution, the federal Constitution, but versus the idea of periodic revision of the Constitution to reflect current values.
Do you want to start?
Sure. So the average life cycle of a constitution around the world is actually, Jefferson predicted it correctly. It's 19 years currently. What happens then is you get a lot of upheaval, not just in the legal system, right, but in the financial system. Think of what happens to the rule of law when you don't know what to expect. But then on the other hand, most drafters expect that they're writing something for generations. The founders didn't think that we would still have our Constitution. They thought it would maybe last 100 years if they were lucky. So we're doing pretty well-ish in that regard. So you have these countervailing concerns of consent. We want to be able to agree to what we're governed by versus stability. And so you've got dead hand of the past ruling, or do you want stability? And I think the medium between these, like the better course between these, is actually frequent amendment, where you have the overall stability. And actually, there's a project out of Chicago and Texas called the Comparative Constitutions Project, and their study of the world's constitutions concluded that the constitutions that are most durable are most frequently amended. So I actually think New Hampshire has that right.
One of the things I believe, I think your system here of an automatic vote every 10 years is too often. I think it should be, if you're going to have that kind of a mechanism, which is interesting, it shifts the burden away from the people who want to propose the new constitution to the people who don't want to have a constitutional convention to look at it's a burden shifting mechanism. I don't know if Jefferson would have described it this way or not, but my own view is 10 years is too often. It sort of trivializes the idea. But by the way, I don't think the 10-year option is exclusive here. I think the legislature could do what it asks the people to approve a constitutional convention at other times, don't you think?
Yeah. I wanted, actually, that was one of the questions I was going to follow up on. So originally, the 1784 Constitution allowed the only method of amendment was through constitutional convention, and every 10 years, the legislature would have to ask the voters, do you want a constitutional convention? And for the first 60 years or so, I think until the mid-1800s, 1850s, there were no constitutional conventions from 1790 to 1850. And then we had, I think, 14 over the course of time. And then in the 1960s, the process changed to allow the legislature to propose amendments to then be submitted to the voters for approval. And so that was a question I was going to ask is when, I mean, we last had that vote, I think, in 2022, and voters, by a very wide margin, decided not to call a constitutional convention. But, you know, for those of the members of the audience here tonight, what should they think about in terms of when that ballot question comes up again? What should they think about in terms of should we call together a constitutional convention? Is this the right time?
Well, every proposal submitted to people in the states since your last constitutional convention in 1984 has been rejected. So there's a political scientists call it a convention phobia. People are afraid of a constitutional convention because they think it will be just more government as usual. And this has gotten worse. You can imagine now, particularly with the advent of dark money. Let's have a constitutional convention. And there are reasons for this that you all understand what the current sort of attitude about government. Now you want more government to be able to make issues more permanent. Most people would say no. I think again there's a problem with the automatic referendum for constitutional conventions because it doesn't seem to allow for a limited constitutional convention. And a number of states have had a lot of success with limited constitutional conventions. We had an extremely successful constitutional convention in New Jersey in 1947, and it was limited. It took certain possibilities off the table. People voted to take them off the table when they approved the Constitutional Convention. So there are a number of problems with calling a Constitutional Convention. I think it boils down to, are you a pessimist or are you an optimist? And so many people, they say, yeah, let's have a constitutional convention. We could change the schools. We could do this. We could decide to have appointed judges instead of elected judges. Don't count on it. You don't know what's going to happen in a constitutional convention. So I think the possibility of a limited constitutional convention to deal with certain matters, some people say, no, you can't limit a constitutional convention, but done pretty successfully in a number of states. So there are a lot of issues, but if you think a convention is going to make it worse, vote, and you're a pessimist, vote against it. If you have some optimism, we could make it better, vote for it. No guarantees.
A different view on the value of constitutional conventions versus legislative proposed amendments and, ultimately ratified by the voters.
So this is not an area of my scholarship that I'm familiar with. Like, I haven't covered this area, so I'm really interested to know. I've had people come to me and say, oh, well, we should have a national constitutional convention. And I lean to, that sounds scary today for on the national level, but it's interesting that there's been you've had these limited conventions. Do I think that, I think on the state level, I have very different thoughts about it. I think it can be healthy. I think it's healthy to amend them, but maybe every 20 years, maybe not every 10 years to make it, or like once a generation, right? I think that would be.
Generation.
So we'll break for another set of questions really quickly in here, just to kind of keep some of these things going. Nancy did ask a question and about explaining the 39-item Bill of Rights in the New Hampshire Constitution. What's that about?
Sure. I don't know, Professor Updike Schulzke, do you want to address that or do you want me to tackle that one?
So sorry, the light's fading here, so I'm just playing with my camera a little bit. So I'm happy to talk about that in relationship to other founding constitutions, but I think you're probably best um, seated to talk about the current number of amendments in the New Hampshire Constitution. So 39 at the time of the founding is actually not totally exceptional. Um, and comparatively, when we compare the New Hampshire Constitution to others around the world, it also isn't as exceptional. The U.S. Constitution is exceptional in how brief it is, and it's brief by design. But originally, Madison had put together 17 amendments that got cut down to 12, and the states only ratified 10. So having numerous amendments and very detailed is more the norm than something like the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, and I was going to say one of the important differences between the U.S. Constitution and the New Hampshire Constitution in sort of concept is the original U.S. Constitution was designed as a government of limited powers. And so the framers felt that they didn't need a Bill of Rights because the federal government only was going to operate in certain limited spheres. On the other hand, state governments exercise what we call in the law police powers, which is essentially to legislate in all areas involving health, safety, welfare, and the moral well-being of the people of the state. And so the Bills of Rights were designed to, and I think Bob alluded to this earlier, were designed to restrain the powers of those very, very broad legislative powers of the courts. And so, 39 articles in order to rein in the power of government is, as Professor Updike Schulzke said, fairly modest number of provisions in the Bill of Rights.
So let's go ahead into the next question. There's a question from Quentin Blaine, and I suspect Marcia Blaine as well. How much did individual personalities of people involved influence the 76 Constitution, the 78 Convention, and final 84 Constitution? Any comments about personality?
Yeah, that's probably Professor Updike Schulzke. You know those personalities better than anyone.
Sure. So this is a really fun question because I learned last I presented that I was mispronouncing it's Meshik-ware, I believe, instead of Meshik-ware. Is that correct,
I think so.
Judge Delker? So he was very influential in 1776, such that he not only was elected, he was elected to the Senate. And the Senate elected him as president of the Senate, which essentially because the 1776 Constitution had no defined executive. And so the president of the Senate acted as the executive. And then he was also selected to be the chief of the Supreme Court. So he effectively combined all three powers. There was no separation of powers under the 1776 Constitution because it was combined in one person in the personality of Meshik-ware. So there's some of the personalities there. 1778, we actually know less about. We know the delegates. There's not a lot of kind of fun personalities that we know of in that convention, and it didn't sit for long. Which is one thing that they changed in 1780 is that the legislature said that the convention would then sit perpetually, and so until a constitution was passed. So we know a little bit more about those for the 80, 81, 82, 83 constitution. George Atkinson is the president, and he has quite an interesting life. But he clearly, we know this by piecing together several documents. He pulls together Woodard, who we know based on some of my research participated as one of these backwoods Dartmouth academics. And then again, Meshik-ware participated as well, that we know from the polemics that they wrote back and forth. And it was because of, as you saw in the broadcast, and as I write in my paper about this, because of, I think, the vitriol between them, it was very clear, number one, that they hated each other, but also that they were working together on the Constitution, on the New Hampshire Constitution. And that made all of the difference in helping people to know that if these people could come together from different sides of the state, different sides of some of these critical issues, especially on the nature and the role of the executive, that we can come together in supporting the Constitution and support it and helping it to cross the finish line. So they played kind of a great role in the '84 Constitution.
So a question from David. I'm going to actually hold off on a little bit of this because it is in the video later, which it's kind of nice to know that the conversation's heading that way in terms of separation of powers. But there is a specific question in here about when the New Hampshire judiciary became seen as having the right and duty to interpretate constitutionally in legislation, that kind of thing. When did that happen, and is it the same as U.S. Supreme Court? How does that work specifically, state to national?
Yeah, so that's probably a question I can tackle. So that I hope I get the date right, but it's about 1812 that the New Hampshire Supreme Court decides a case that really tackles this question of the separation of powers for the first time. Up until that point, if you had a trial in a court like we understand it today, and you didn't like the outcome of that trial, you could petition to the legislature, and the legislature could pass a bill to give you a new trial and say, hey, we didn't think that original trial went well, or we don't like the outcome of that original trial, so we're going to give you a new trial and kick it back to the court. And in 1812, the New Hampshire Supreme Court said, hey, the legislature is overstepping its bounds. That is a judicial act. It is our responsibility to adjudicate cases, to decide the outcome of cases. Stay in your lane. That is not a judicial function. You are engaging in a judicial function, not a legislative function, and so you're crossing over the separation of powers. And it's sort of, that is one of the foundational cases that establishes the court's ability to interpret the Constitution, to say, here are our spheres of influence, here are your spheres of influence, and stay in your lane. The development of judicial review at the federal level occurs around the same time, a little bit earlier. Marbury versus Madison, of course, the seminal case from I think 1802, 3, somewhere in that range. That case was decided, and that's where John Marshall for the court set down the ability of the courts to the U.S. Supreme Court to say what the law is. His famous saying, "Say thank you, 1803."
Just as a guy who lives in New Jersey and taught in New Jersey, the latest conclusion, I think, of scholars about this is that the first example of judicial review in the country was during the war, 1780, in New Jersey, where the New Jersey legislature passed a bill saying people accused of trading with the enemy only get a 6-person jury. And the New Jersey Constitution, even though it didn't have a proper Bill of Rights, in the body of the Constitution was the right to jury trial as it existed in English common law. And during the war, a New Jersey court said, you can't try this guy charged with trading with the enemy. Can you imagine the politics of that case? Said you can't try the guy without a 12-person jury. And that's thought to be the first case in the country of the practice of judiciary declaring a legislative law unconstitutional. For some reason, Chief Justice Marshall couldn't be bothered to cite that case in his famous Marbury decision some years later.
So the New Jersey case is interesting because there's actually a few state Supreme Courts doing this. You also, I believe, have a Rhode Island case. I have a paper that just came out on this called "Becoming Written Constitutionalism," and there's a little bit of a precedent in the United States specifically that somewhat came from the structure of the colonies versus British courts, because they would appeal up to a British court just like they would, and you have it actually before Marbury, Hilton versus Ware, Chisholm versus Georgia, but these opinions are written what's called seriatim, where each judge in the British fashion writes their own decision, and it's hard to track what the majority decision is. And so this is happening, but it's a bit piecemeal. And I think it's the result of them realizing what it means to have this thing that we now call a written constitution, and what that means for creating a tiered structure of law where the Constitution governs as fundamental law, ordinary law. And that requires an arbiter. Now, at the Constitutional Convention, they knew that they needed an arbiter, but it wasn't clear who that arbiter would be. So judicial review was happening. Like, for instance, Hamilton in the Federalist Papers clearly thinks that there should be judicial review. Madison wants to find other options as an arbiter. He proposes other options, and ultimately, as we know in Marbury versus Madden, we do select the judiciary to decide what the law is. But it's not clear to everybody who the arbiter should be between fundamental and ordinary law until later.
That's a great question. So we're going to, it is 6 o'clock now. Because of our technical difficulties, we're running a few minutes behind. So thanks for sticking with us. I'm going to suggest we press on through the last of the presentation, and then we'll get a few questions in at the end.
That's true.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience. So one of the questions is how slavery impacted the discussion of the framing of the Constitution. And I don't, perhaps at least at the New Hampshire level, did that issue come up at all in your research?
So I actually have another article on this that's just coming out in the Columbia Journal of Race and Law, and it's called "We the Free Black People." So I actually have done a lot of more, on the federal level, but I did a lot of research on New Hampshire specifically. And that came out of my research on the New Hampshire Constitution, because I was fascinated to know that slavery essentially was out of fashion. In the 1790 census, you have 165 slaves and many more free blacks. We call them free blacks, but anyway, there's a lot of intermarriage, so that's not technically true. Anyway, beside that technical point, they might have been Native Americans that had a different complexion, that were called other free people. Anyway, that was how they were categorized in the census. But in any event, so because I looked, I was really fascinated to learn several things about the New Hampshire process, and that if you look at the town records, which are largely preserved by the state library, you find free blacks on the voting records and represented in town meetings. In fact, there was in the Revolution, several homes were destroyed in Portsmouth, and then they were made into a graveyard for black people living in Portsmouth. And the vote by the town was not to build on top of that. The owners came back and said, "We want this land back," and the town said, "No, that is sacrosanct land." And I thought, for 1782, that was remarkable. So I think New Hampshire has a lot to be proud of. Slavery dies away quite quickly. It's out of fashion, and it's thought that the New Hampshire Constitution, we don't have the records, so we don't actually know. There's no records, unfortunately. Hopefully you find them at some point in the very important work that he's doing. But there's a relevant provision that's borrowed from the Massachusetts Constitution that's right at the beginning of your form of government, or after you get through the rights. Actually, I think it's at the beginning of the Bill of Rights. Where it says, it copies language from the Declaration that all men are created equal. And then later, it talks about, there's no limitation when it talks about who can vote. It's all men. Obviously, it doesn't include women, unfortunately. New Jersey got that right. You say all inhabitants, and there were women who voted there. In fact, there's a free black woman.
40 years.
Yes, and then they
backed the wrong candidate.
That's right. So at least on that issue, it doesn't show up necessarily, because I think in part because of their religious sentiments, and how the state had been formed, or how the province and colony had been formed. This was something that they felt very strongly that free blacks should participate, and they did. They voted in small numbers, but they did vote.
It's a big issue in lots of states in many different ways.
So we had a question from a former law enforcement officer who had a question about Fourth Amendment, and I think probably more, this goes back to my original observation, which is a lot of people talk about their Fourth Amendment rights and not their right to a protection against unreasonable search and seizures. So New Hampshire actually deals with this issue differently than the federal government under the Fourth Amendment. Professor Williams, maybe are you familiar with those differences?
Well, I don't know the specific New Hampshire cases, but it's an area of lots and lots of litigation. This is comes up in all kinds of contexts. Can there be a search and seizure, and is it reasonable or unreasonable? And there are hundreds of cases around the country, lots of articles, books about this, and it's extremely important in the law enforcement and criminal defense and criminal prosecution context, because the basic rule is that Fourth Amendment cases in federal law, particularly decided by the United States Supreme Court, most people think those cases answer the question, what's an unreasonable search or seizure? No, those cases set the national minimum standard under the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution for the whole country. But any of the 50 state Supreme Courts, they all have this clause about, usually reads exactly like the federal Fourth Amendment, but any state through its state courts can interpret that kind of a provision to be, most people call it more liberal, I like to call it more protective than the national minimum standard. So many of the states have, in New Jersey, we must have 25 cases that go up about on search and seizure that go up above the national minimum standard. So it's one of the earliest places where states began to assert their judicial independence.
So, Professor Updike Schulzke, I don't know if you came across anything in your research. New Hampshire, I don't know if it's unique, but it's certainly one of very few states that has a specific article in the Bill of Rights allowing for a right to revolution. What is that, and how'd that end up in the Bill of Rights?
So that comes from John Locke. He was fairly controversially, he argued this actually as a way to justify the Glorious Revolution in 1688 and 89 in England. It was a bloodless revolution, but Parliament actually changed the right of succession from their Catholic king, James II, who finally produced a Catholic heir with his second wife. And that they got busy and then invited William and Mary. William was a cousin, and Mary was not quite in line for succession, but she was a descendant of James I. They invited them over from the Dutch Republic, and so Parliament changed from a Catholic king to a Protestant, and he justified that by saying, when the form of government is changed by either the king or Parliament, the people have a right to revolt. And so this is actually what gives rise to the Declaration. There's a lot that happens in Congress, but Thomas Paine is kind of beats this drum in Common Sense early, in line with the first first New Hampshire Constitution in January of 1776. So there's a long provenance for it. It's interesting that they preserve it in their constitution, because that's opposite of how you want a constitution to run, right? You don't want people to revolt. You want to swing over to the conservative side so that it lasts. But anyway, that's where it comes from.
Thank you. So we have a question from the audience. I'm going to sort of reframe it slightly, which is this issue about how state constitutions may be used, or whether they can be used in any way to check overreach of federal government, or does the Supremacy Clause make states basically in the backseat to the federal government? What ways does federalism act as a check against national overreach?
It's a big issue currently, and there's a lot going on with this, but it's pretty limited. The areas that states can compete with the federal government are really in the areas that were never given away to the federal government. So the states have a lot of authority, but it really, in any case I can really think of it, it can't collide with valid federal exercises of authority. What we deal with is what the federal government has done, which the states don't like. Is it valid under the authority that was given to the federal government? And so there's going to be lots of arguments about that. They're already going on now. But in a direct collision, the states lose.
How about religion? What role, if any, did religion play in the framing of the New Hampshire Constitution?
So again, we don't have records from the conventions, but you can pick up on this in the documents that were left. And as we all know in this room, New Hampshire was essentially formed, except for some that came up from Connecticut, from transplants from Massachusetts. And so there's a Puritan founding, or a separatist or congregationalist founding of the state when it was, or the colony when those first came over from England. And so you see that thread throughout. You see provisions copied from the Massachusetts Constitution, which is not unique. All of the constitutions copied from one another. Really, George Mason in Virginia wrote the OG Constitution that everybody copied from. So religion plays a role in the sense that everybody basically is a Protestant to some extent. There are some Jewish congregations, not many. I'm actually not aware that there's any in New Hampshire. I'm not aware that there are any what they call Muslims or what they called Turks at that time in New Hampshire per se. But there are Quakers in small numbers. There are mostly Congregationalists, and then of course Anglicans become Episcopalians. So this is the fabric of who they are, and they actually believe in a right. A student of mine actually did the research on this. They believe that the towns had a right to establish a minister there and to pay, meaning that they would pay as a town for that minister. And you see that in your original Constitution. Now, it's much more interesting than the Massachusetts variant because it says nobody is going to be obliged to pay for a minister from a congregation that they don't attend. So they preserve free exercise along with, they actually preserve establishment on the town level. So it plays a role in the sense of this is who they are, and they believed that religion helped them to be good citizens. When you have a republic, it's reliant on the citizenry to run it. And the virtue that was necessary, the civic virtue that was necessary to run government, was simpatico with many religious principles. And so that's at least how they conceived of it and how it influenced. But again, we don't have the records, and so we don't know the exact role. But these were all religious people.
So let me go back to the 1776 New Hampshire Constitution, because we haven't talked a lot about that document itself. You alluded to the fact that it was a very short document, 900 words, I think more than half of which was the preamble. Talk a little bit about the structure of government. So there was not a lot of separation of power in that original government from 1776 to 1784. And then I'm going to ask a follow-up question to you, Professor Willams, about that.
So very simple governmental structure. It basically sets up a legislature. At least it's not unicameral, right, like Pennsylvania. There's a lower body and upper body that's chosen by the lower body, and then the executive is chosen by the upper body. There's no mention, or very brief mention, actually, I don't know if I can't remember if there's a mention of the judiciary. Actually, there is. It says that the legislature can appoint the judiciary. That's correct. And so what happens in actuality is that Meshach ware is voted into the upper chamber, and then essentially becomes, as the president of the Senate, he becomes the executive. So he's part of the legislature. He is the executive. And then he's appointed as the chief judge of the Supreme Court. So we have in one man a unification of all what we would consider branches of government. And not everybody liked that, I should say.
So I bet a number of people in the audience have watched the Ken Burns American Revolution special, and in one of those episodes, he talked a lot about the radical Pennsylvania Constitution, which, as Professor Updike Schulzke just alluded to, had a single legislature, not bicameral, and essentially no separation of powers. So this seems to have been a theme in that early revolutionary period, and I'm wondering how those early constitutions impacted later constitutions like New Hampshire's 1784 Constitution and ultimately the U.S. Constitution.
It's interesting. I was thrilled when the Ken Burns documentary mentioned that. I elbowed my wife in the ribs. Listen to that, honey. But of the 1776 constitutions, I have to say, I don't want to offend anybody here, but the New Hampshire one wasn't the most important. The most important was Pennsylvania, and they were all overreactions to the British colonial administration. Governor, we're not having a governor. We hated the British governors. We don't need some aristocratic guy, who would always be a guy in those days, vetoing our laws, whatever. We don't need a Senate, a bunch of, just think of what you think of Senates these days. Somebody who's going to cancel out what the proposals of the popular branch are. We don't need judges striking down what our people's government has enacted. And this was the Pennsylvania Constitution. Dependent judges, no governor, a little committee that was supposed to do what the legislature said, no Senate to block. It was a disaster. It sounded good at the time. We are throwing off the bounds of the colonial masters. We know what we need to do. We will run a government that won't have these aristocratic features to it. Complete disaster, lasted 14 years. Much of the debate at the Federal Constitutional Convention was, let's don't do anything like the Pennsylvania Constitution, for God's sakes. Even from the Pennsylvania delegates, they were saying, no way. The important thing, though, is that the Pennsylvania Constitution developed a language for, in those days, I don't think we could use the word progressive, but the sort of people who weren't in the elites during the colonial period to argue that they should take over the government in a way to benefit themselves and not be canceled out by these aristocratic features. And that was a powerful argument up and down the seaboard. It was surfaced in almost all the states, but it prevailed in the most complete way in Pennsylvania, and it didn't work. And it set up the next stage, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, even a little bit in New York, to start to say, no, we gotta. Pennsylvania had the rhetoric of separation of powers, but it didn't have the teeth of checks and balances. You could just imagine that from this discussion about no checks. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and the later states developed that, and that was the model for our U.S. Constitution, a so-called balanced government with real separation of powers and real checks and balances.
Yeah, so I just wanted to respond a little bit. I agree wholeheartedly that the Pennsylvania Constitution was important. It was actually copied, in support of what you're saying, it was actually copied almost verbatim by Vermont. It was sent up, and
Georgia a little bit too.
Yeah, exactly. And John Adams responded to this, and this is why he wrote Thoughts on Government. And so you have two basically competing models at the framing. But I want to contend a little bit with your point that the New Hampshire Constitution was important. In terms of content, I would agree with you. But in terms of its significance, in being the first Constitution, this is what this meant. Because John Sullivan had this feint, right, that he made up this petition, it opened up the doors of Congress to begin thinking about allowing states to take up government, to start this process of writing what we now call constitutions. So New Hampshire was the first, and then that allowed, because you see, the same day that New Hampshire is approved, they appoint committees to allow South Carolina and Virginia, who also had exigent circumstances, to write their constitutions. And then finally in May 15th of 1776, Congress said, forget it. Everybody gets to write a constitution. Adams, you win. Just do what's best for the people before independence is declared. So it's important in that because this is the first, this not only opens up the floodgates of constitution writing in the US, it's the first constitution in the world. So content-wise, I agree that it's not as important, but it's important for what it represents and what it did in terms of instantiating the writing of constitutions.
It's a great point. And if I remember, essentially the first line of the January 1776 New Hampshire Constitution says, we were elected to do this. I don't think it, sort of, unique in the world, I think, at that point. And then I think it was a number of months later that Pennsylvania did. They were elected too. But.
So going back to this idea about this.
Well, all right. So we're going to break for the last set of questions now. And I have cut off one question that I'd like to have an update on. Judge Delker had a really great question about where do people see some of this today, which I think we might be in a different spot than we were in February. So I would love to kind of have that renewed. But before we get to that, a couple of questions from the audience. One was about, oh, I'm sorry, I got to track way back in my notes. One was a question from Douglas about the idea that Douglas is concerned that we might be facing a constitutional crisis at the federal level due to executive overreach and failure for the legislature to fulfill its checks and balances role, and asks, what options would we have in New Hampshire if we had an executive and that was overreaching, and the executive council, which has that role, the legislature, the judiciary weren't fulfilling their role to rein that in. Any thoughts on that?
So maybe I can take that one. So New Hampshire's executive branch is, so I'm not a comparative constitutional or state constitutional scholar, but it is one of the weaker executive branches or executive offices across the states, because New Hampshire governor is elected every 2 years. I think it's one of only a couple of states that elect their governor every 2 years. Many of the governor's decisions have to be approved by the 5-member elected executive council, which approves all appointments and also all purchases. They just increased the amount, but it's either $10,000 or $15,000. Any contracts over $10,000 or $15,000 have to be approved by the executive council. And the other check on the executive branch in New Hampshire is that executive agency heads can have a term that extends beyond the governor's term. So, for example, the attorney general serves for a 4-year term. The commissioner of the Department of Health and Human Services or Corrections. So you may inherit an executive agency head from a governor of the opposite party who continues in office for a couple of years. And so there's a number of ways within the executive branch itself there are checks. on executive power. And then, of course, the courts and the legislature that are supposed to do their jobs as well. And so I think New Hampshire is much, much different than the federal system in that regard.
So we are coming up on 6:30, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time and get us out so people can enjoy the rest of the evening. But one last question for our panel, if you could answer in just a sentence or two, what Judge Delker had asked at the end of the last one was, what principles around what we've been talking about tonight remain relevant today? And you might have a different answer than you had back in February. So I wanted to give you a chance to update or rethink that. And Judge Delker, if you want to jump in with your thoughts as well, that's great also. Anybody willing to go first?
I could just start off and say the key principle really of state constitutions that differs somewhat from the federal constitution is that all of the power that states have emanates directly from the people. It's the foundational authority for the use of power under state constitutions, and the mechanisms of government in the states are over and over again much more democratic. We have many more opportunities to influence our state government than we do to influence the federal government. We need to take advantage of that.
Michael, I'll take a shot here. And that is, I actually am going to lean even harder into what I said in February. And that is what the New Hampshire founding tells us and what it illustrates for all the other constitution makers out there, and that I've highlighted in my scholarship, is that it is incredibly important. It's crucial to talk to people across the aisle, across all of the aisles. Talk to people that you don't like, whose opinions you hate, and try to understand them, especially as we hit up against these issues that will fundamentally change how we govern. I mentioned in February that we have the issue of abortion right now that the states are deciding. We have other issues about how we interact with the federal government. How do we respond to all that's happening? Talk to people that you disagree. One thing that's happening with social media is that we don't get to interact with people with whom we disagree because social media creates silos, echo chambers, where we only hear our own opinions and those with whom we agree. Try to understand what's going on the other side, on all of the other sides, so you can make better better well-informed opinions, and so that we can come together as a society on some of these issues. And sometimes you will surprise yourself because sometimes there are really good arguments on the other side that might create bridges between the two.
And I'll jump in and say, that I think, sort of reiterate what I started with, is so much attention is focused on what happens at the national level, and people forget about how important the state constitution is and state government is. And in reality, as a judge, I realize this very acutely. Most of what affects everyone's day-to-day lives emanates at the state level, because the state constitution and state government have these broad powers of regulating health, safety, welfare, and the general morals of the community. And the Constitution is designed to restrict those powers. And I think people really should focus on the state, focus on what's happening at the state level, focus on their state constitution, because so much emanates about what happens every day in our schools, in our police departments, on our streets, in our zoning boards. All of that affect individuals in a much more direct way than what is happening at the national level.
Thank you, Judge Delker. Thank you, Professor Willams. Thank you, Professor Updike Schulzke. You all have been amazing for being on tonight. Thank you so much. And I know that some of you have places to go, so you should take off. The rest of you, just want to do a quick closeout. Thank you all for being part of the program tonight. You should join us on June 26th for our next Humanities at Home, which is a US at 250 Big Watch. We're bringing the Big Watch, which is a discussion of Ken Burns' American Revolution documentary. You don't have to have seen it already. We'll be showing a mini version of that and then having discussion around it as part of our recognition of the US at 250. We will also be doing more of these programs in the future. I do, as always, thank those of you who support New Hampshire Humanities. This would not be possible without you in this rather difficult time we've been having in the last year. And we encourage you to support us, to find out more about programs, to be part of the community, and to attend programs at your local libraries, historical societies, and other parts of your community. Find out more at nhhumanities.org. After the program, you will get a link with a questionnaire. This was an experiment. We haven't done anything this kind of hybrid before, so we would love to get feedback from you. That helps us make our programs better. And most of all, thank you so much for being part of the community of New Hampshire and supporting the humanities all around the state. Have a good night, enjoy your weekend, and we will hope to see you all soon.